Hello again, everyone, and welcome back to the Magic the Gathering unofficial audiobooks podcast. We are reading book 2 of the Artifact Cycle, Planeswalker. A quick reminder to feel free to share the heck out of this. I've already seen audience numbers grow, and that is thanks to you. I really appreciate it. Keeps me motivated and excited to keep pumping out these episodes. You can also follow me on Twitter at PhilInSendai, and if you want to support the show on Patreon, where we have different levels of support, you can there. Also, if anyone has an idea for like a title sponsorship, I'm looking for that too. I talked to my local game store, but they were a little hesitant due to how taxing of online card purchases happens from state to state, so it can be a little bit of a challenge, but I'll give a shout out to them anyway. Mox Mania in Madison, Wisconsin. Simply a great store run by great people, so feel free to give them your money. And that is something like a title sponsorship would be. I got 20 years of broadcast writing experience, so if someone does have an idea for a sponsor, I'd consult with them and put together good copy and make it really great. And it'd basically replace what I'm doing here right now. Anyway, I hope you all are well. Let's get to it. Chapter 3. Morning came to the Orin Ridge and found Zansha sitting in the bottom of a transparent sphere as it drifted above springtime mountain meadows. The sphere was as big around as Zansha was tall and had been a gift from Urza, or more accurately, the artifact that produced it had been Urza's gift. He'd devised the cyst to preserve her as she followed him from world to world. A deliberate yawn and a mnemonic rhyme drew a protective oil out of the cyst. Depending on the rhyme, the oil expanded into the buoyant sphere or ripened into a tough, flexible armor. Urza had taught Zansha the rhyme for the armor. The sphere was the result of Zansha's curiosity and improvisations. Urza complained that she'd transformed his Thran-inspired artifact into a Phyrexian abomination. The complaint, though sincere, had always perplexed Zansha. The Thran, as Urza described them, believed that sentience and artifice must always be separate. Zansha's cyst wasn't remotely sentient, and she supposed she could have dug it out of her stomach, but it had become part of her, no different than her arms or Urza's faceted eyes. Besides, if she hadn't discovered how to make her sphere, Urza would have to provide her with food, clothing, and all the other things a flesh and blood person required, because Zansha, though she was almost as old as Urza, was indisputably flesh and blood, and just as indisputably Phyrexian. Zansha willed the sphere higher, seeking the swift wind streams well above the mountains. She had a long journey planned and needed strong winds if she wanted to finish it before Urza returned from the south. The sphere rose until the landscape resembled Urza's tabletop, and the sphere began to tumble. Tumbling never bothered Zansha, with or without the cyst. She had a strong stomach and an unshakable sense of direction, but tumbling wasted time and energy. Zansha raised her arms level with her shoulders, one straight out in front of her, the other extended to the side. The tumbling stopped. Then she pointed both extended arms in the direction she wished to travel and rotated her hands so they were both palms up. She thought of rigging and sails. A firm hand on the tiller board, and the sphere began to move against the wind. It was slow going at first, but before the sun had risen another 2 handspans, Zansha was scudding north faster than any horse could run. Zansha couldn't explain how the sphere stayed aloft. It wasn't sorcery. She had no talent for calling upon the land. Urza swore it wasn't anything to do with him or his artifacts and refused to discuss the matter. Zansha thought it was no different than running. The whys and wherefores weren't important so long as she found what she was looking for and got home safe. But questions lurked where Zansha's memories began. They crept forward once the sphere was moving smartly. There was nothing to do but think and remember. The beginning was liquid, thick and warm as blood, dark and safe. After the liquid came light and cold, emptiness and hard edges, a dim chamber in the fane of flesh, the first place she'd known, a soot-stained monolith of Phyrexia's 4th sphere. Her beginning wasn't birth, not as Urza had been born from his mother's body. There were no mothers or fathers in the decanting chamber, only metal and leather priests tending stone-gouged vats. The vat priests of the Fane of Flesh were of no great status. Though complete, their appliances were mere hooks and paddles, and their senses were no better than the flesh they'd been decanted with. They took orders from above. In Phyrexia, there was always above, or within, deeper and deeper through the 8 spheres to the center, where dwelt the Ineffable, he whose name was known, but never spoken, lest he awaken from his blessed sleep. "Obey," the vat priest said unnecessarily as she shivered and discovered her limbs. A small, warm stone fell from her hands. The vat priest had said it was her heart, and took it from her. There was a place, they said, in Phyrexia. Everything had a place. Without place, there was nothing where hearts were kept. Her mistakes would be written on her heart, and if she made too many mistakes, the Ineffable, who dwelt at Phyrexia's core, would make her a part of his dreams, and that would be the end of her. Obey and learn. Pay attention. Make no mistakes. Now, follow. Later, when Xantcha had crossed more planes and visited more worlds than she could easily recount, she'd realized that there was no other place like Phyrexia. In no other world were full-grown newts like her decanted beside a sludge vat. Only Phyrexian newts remembered the first opening of their eyes. Only Phyrexian newts remembered and understood the first words, threats they heard. In her beginning, there was only the Fane of Flesh, and she obeyed without question, writhing across the stone floor because she hadn't had the strength to walk. Xantcha's bones hardened quickly. She learned to tend herself and perform such tasks as were suited to newts. When she had mastered those lessons, the vat priests led her to the teacher priests, who instructed the newts as they were transformed from useless flesh into complete Phyrexians. The teacher priests, with their recording eyes and stinging switch arms, told her that she was Xantcha. Xantcha wasn't a name, not as she later came to understand names. When Urza had asked, she had explained that Xantcha was the place where she stood when newts were assembled for instruction, the place where she received her food, and the box where she slept at night. If days or nights had played a part in her early life, Phyrexia was a world without sun, moon, or stars. Deep in the Fane of Flesh, priests called out the march of time. When she learned, when she ate, when she slept, there was no time for rest, no place for companionship. When she was returned to her box for sleeping, Xantcha dreamed of sunlight, grass, and wind. She might have thought it strange that her mind held images of a place so clearly not Phyrexia, if she had thought at all. Even now, more than 3 millennia after her first awakenings, Xantcha didn't know if she'd been the only newt who've dreamed of green, sunlit world, or if the Ineffable had commanded the same dreams and longings for every newt that learned beside her. You are newts, and newts you will remain, the teacher priests had taught her. You are destined to sleep in another place and prepare the way for those who will follow. Listen and obey. There were many other newts in the Fane of Flesh, organized into cadres and marched together through their educations. All newts began the same way, with meat and bones and blood-filled veins. Then, according to their place in the Ineffable's design, tender priests excised their flesh and reshaped their bodies with tough amalgams of metal and oil until they were completed. After each reshaping, the priests sent the excised flesh and blood to the renderers. Eventually, it was returned to the vats. When the newt was fully reshaped, the tenders immersed it in the glistening oil, and Phyrexian's first time in the great fountain outside the Fane of Flesh. When it emerged, the newt was complete and took its destined place in the Ineffable's grand plan for Phyrexia. Xantcha remembered standing in her place on the Fane balcony as fully reshaped newts were carried to the fountain. She remembered the cacophony as newly completed Phyrexians emerged into the glare and glow of the fourth sphere furnaces. To the extent that any newt felt hope, it hoped for a good completion, a privileged place. The knowledge that she would be forever bound in a newt's body was greater pain than any punishment the priests ever lashed across her back. Hatred had no place in Phyrexia. Contempt replaced hatred and looked down on the special newts, whose destiny was to sleep in another place. Xantcha looked forward to the moments when she was alone in her box with her dreams. Once she went to sleep, dreamed her dreams as she'd always done, and awoke beneath the bald grayed sky of the first sphere. There were different teacher priests tending her cadre. The new priests were larger than those in the Fane of Flesh, more metal than leather. They had 4 feet and 4 arms. Their feet were clawed, and each of their arms ended in a different metal weapon. They were supposed to protect the newts from the dangers of the first sphere. Newts had never dwelt on the first sphere, but the four-armed teachers were not honored by their new responsibilities. They obeyed their orders without enthusiasm until one of the newts made a mistake. Newts you are, and newts you shall remain forever, they'd recite as they dealt out punishment with one hand after another. You are destined to sleep on another world. Now learn the ways of another world. Listen and obey. Xantcha wondered what would have happened if she failed to listen or obey. At the time, the notion simply didn't occur to her. Life on the first sphere was hard enough without disobedience. The newts were taught farming in preparation for a day when their destiny would be fulfilled, but the slippery dirt of the first sphere resisted their every effort. The plows, sickles, hoes, and pitchforks that they were commanded to use left their muscles aching. The whip-like razor grass, the only plant they could grow, slashed them bloody, and harsh light blistered their skin mercilessly. Xantcha remembered another newt, Gianja, whose place was near hers in the Kandre. Gianja had used a grass sheath to hack off its arm, then shoved a pitchfork shaft into the bloody socket. Gianja was meat by the time they found it, but Xantcha and the other newts understood why it had done what it had. Newts were small and fragile compared to everything else that dwelt on the first sphere. Their uncompleted bodies suffered injuries rather than malfunctions. They could not be repaired, but were left to heal as best as they could, which sometimes wasn't good enough. Failed newts, meat newts, were whisked back to the fourth sphere for rendering. Waste not, want not. Nothing in Phyrexia was completely without use, though meat was reviled by the complete, who transcended their flesh and were sustained by glistening oil. As her cadre was reduced to meat, Xantcha's place within it changed. Another newt should have been Xantcha. She should have become Jizixi or Kratzin, but too much time had passed since the Vat priests had organized the cadre. The patterns of their minds were as fixed as those of their soft, battered bodies. Xantcha she was, and Xantcha she remained, even when the cadre had shrunk so much that the priests alloyed it with another, similarly depleted group. Xantcha found herself face to face with another Xantcha. For both of them it was confusion. The word scarcely existed in Phyrexia except to describe the clots of slag and ash that accumulated beneath the great furnaces. Together they consulted the priests, as newts were trained to do. The priests judged that as a result of the recombination, neither of them truly stood in the spot of Xantcha. The alloyed cadre Xantcha was a third newt who thought of itself Hazkrin and wanted no part of this Xantcha confusion. Xantcha and Xantcha were each told to recognize new places within the alloyed cadre or face the lash. Lash or no, the priest's judgment was not acceptable. Places had become names that could not be surrendered, even under the threat of punishment. The Xantchas stayed awake when they should have slept in their boxes. They slipped away from the priests and spoke to each other privately. Meeting in private with another newt was something neither had done before. They negotiated and they compromised, though there were no Phyrexian words for either process. They agreed to make themselves unique. Xantcha broke off a blade of razor-sharp grass and hacked off the hair growing on the left side of her skull. The other Xantcha soaked its hair in an acid stream until it turned orange. They had rebelled. A word as forbidden as the Ineffable's true name and almost as feared. Only the tender priests could change a newt's shape, and only according to the Ineffable's plan. When the Xantchas returned to the place where their cadre gathered for food and sleep, the other newts gaped and turned away, as the teacher priests came rumbling and clanking from the perimeter. Xantcha had taken the other newt's flesh-fingered hand. 3,300 Dominarian years afterward, Xantcha knew that the touch of flesh was a language unto itself, a language that Phyrexia had forgotten. At the time, the gesture had confused the priests utterly and left them spinning in their tracks. Not long after, the bald grayed sky had brightened painfully. Xantcha had recalled her heart in the Vat priest's threat. Too many mistakes, and the Ineffable would seize her heart. Until the other Xantcha had tumbled into her life, she'd made less than her share of the cadre's mistakes. But perhaps one mistake, if it were great enough, was enough to rouse the Ineffable. She thought the shining creature who had descended from the too bright sky was the Ineffable. He was nothing like the priest she'd seen, and nothing at all like a newt. His eyes were intensely red, and an abundance of teeth filled his protruding jaw. And she'd known, perhaps because of that jaw filled with teeth, that it was he, as the Ineffable was he, and not in the way of newts and priests. "You can call me Gix," he'd said, using his toothsome jaw to shape the words in an almost newtish way. though he didn't have the soft flesh lips that were useful for eating but got in the way of proper Phyrexian pronunciation. Gix was a name, the first true name Xantcha had ever heard, because it couldn't be interpreted as a place within a cadre. Gix was a demon, a Phyrexian who looked upon the ineffable face with his own eyes, and who, while the ineffable slept, controlled Phyrexia. From a Newt's lowly perspective, a demon's name might just as well be the ineffable. Gix offered his hand. The only sound Xantcha heard was a slight whirring as his arm extended and extended to at least twice his height. As Gix's hand unfurled, black talons sprang from each elegantly articulated finger. He touched the other Xantcha lightly beneath the chin. Xantcha felt trembling terror in the other Newt's hand. The demon's talons looked as if they could pierce a priest's leather carapace or go straight through a Newt's skull. A blue-green spark leapt from the demon to the other Xantcha, whose hand immediately warmed, relaxed, and slipped away. Deep-pitched rumbling came out of the demon's throat. He lowered his hand. His head swiveled slightly, and Xantcha felt a cold, green light take her measure. Gix didn't touch her as he touched the other Xantcha. His arm retreated, each segment clicking sharply into the one behind it, then more whirring as his jaw assumed a sickle smile. Xantcha. All remaining doubts about the difference between names and places vanished. Xantcha had become a true name, and confronted with him, Xantcha became hers. The notions for male and female, dominance and submission were already in Xantcha's mind, rooted in her dreams of soft green grass and yellow sun. "You will be ready," the demon said. "I made you. No simple rendering for you. Xantcha, fresh meat, fresh blood, brought here from the place where you will go, where you will conquer. You will have their cunning, their boldness, and their unpredictability, Xantcha. But your heart is mine. You are mine forever." The demon meant to frighten her, and he did. He meant to distract her, too, while a blue-green spark formed on his shiny brass brow. In that, he was less successful. Xantcha saw the spark race toward her, felt it strike the ridge between her eyes and bury itself in the bone. The demon had inserted himself in her mind. He made himself glorious before her. At least, that's what he tried to do. Xantcha felt the urge to worship him in awe and obedience, to feed him with the mind-storm turbulence no complete Phyrexian could experience, except by proxy. Gix made promises in Xantcha's mind, privilege, power, and passion, all of them irresistible, or meant to be irresistible. But Xantcha resisted. She made a new place for herself, within herself. It wasn't terribly difficult. If there could be two Xantchas within the cadre, there could be two within her mind, and Xantcha who belonged to Gix, and Xantcha who did not. She filled the part that belonged to Gix with images from her dreams, blue skies, green grass, and gentle breezes. The demon drank them down, then spat them out. The light went out of his eyes. He turned away from her, to others in her cadre, and found them more entertaining. For her part, Xantcha stood very still. She had denied the demon, rejected him before he could reject her. She expected instant annihilation, but the ineffable did not seize her. Whatever else she had done, it was not a mistake great enough to destroy her heart. After sating himself on nudish thoughts and passions, Gix departed. The teacher priests sought to reclaim their place above the cadre, but after the elegance and horror of a demon, they seemed puny. In time, they became afraid of their charges and kept their distance as the Newts began to talk more freely among themselves, planning for their glorious futures on other worlds. Xantcha maintained her place, eating, sleeping, laboring, and taking part in the discussions, but she was no longer like the other Newts. That moment, when she created two Xantchas in her mind, had transformed her, as surely as the tender priest reshaped Newts in the vein of flesh. She was aware of herself as no one else, except Gix, seemed to be. She stumbled into loneliness, and, seeking relief from that singular ache, she sought out the Xantcha whose hand she once held. "I am without," she said, because at that time she hadn't known a better word. "I need to touch you." She offered both hands, but the other Xantcha had reeled backward, screaming as if it were in terrible pain. The rest of the cadre swarmed between them, and Xantcha was lucky to survive. Xantcha remembered the newt that had sawed off its arm with the razor grass, but what she had wanted was an end to her isolation, not an end of existence. She considered running away. The first sphere was vast. Newt could easily lose herself behind the shimmering horizon, but if she placed herself behind her cadre and its priest, Zancha would slowly starve, because despite their constant efforts with hoes and plows and sickles, nothing edible grew in the first sphere's soil. Except for the meaty sludge brought up from the fane of flesh, there was nothing on Phyrexia's first sphere that a Newt could eat. When the cadre closed ranks to keep her from the simmering cauldrons the priest brought from the fane, Zancha picked up a sickle and cleared a path for her to place. 5 Newts went down with the cauldron for rendering, 1 priest too. Zancha went to sleep with a full stomach and the sense that she'd never reopen her eyes. But neither Gix nor the Ineffable came to claim her. Once again, it seemed that she hadn't made a mistake. Others did. Newts began to disappear, a few at a time, while they slept. Zancha contrived to make a tiny hole in her box. She kept watch when she would have been asleep, but the Ineffable wasn't consuming Newts. Instead, priests picked up a box here, a box there, and took them away. Speaker-equipped priests could spew words faster than soft-lipped Newts. Sometimes they forgot that Newts heard faster than they spoke. Zancha hid in a place on the edge and listened to chittering, metallic conversations. The moment she and the other Newts had been promised since their decanting had arrived. Newts were leaving Phyrexia. They were sleeping on another world. One of the priests had gone through the portal. It didn't like what it had found. Its coils had corroded and its joints had clogged because water, not oil, flowed everywhere, in fountains across the land and in blinding torrents from the sky that was sometimes blue, sometimes black, sometimes speckled, and sometimes streaked with fire. A worthless place, the priest said. Rust and dust fit only for Newts. Zancha held her breath as she held it before Gix. Although she'd never seen or felt it, she remembered water and knew in her bones that a place where water fell from the sky would be a place where the Newt could get lost without necessarily starving. She began to make herself more useful, more visible to the others, in hopes that the priests would pick her box. But though the disappearances continued, the priests didn't take her. The cadre withered. Zancha was certain she'd be taken away. There simply weren't that many left. Then the taking stopped. The Newts slept and worked, slept and worked. Zancha wasn't the only one who listened to the priests. None of them liked what they heard. There were problems in the other world. Newts had been exposed and destroyed. 30 centuries after the fact, when she and Urza returned to Dominaria, Zancha had pieced together what might have happened. Appended to some of the oldest chronicles in her collection were accounts of strangers, undersized and eerily identical, who'd appeared suddenly and throughout what was left of Terra Sire some 20 years after the Brothers' War had ended. The Dominarians hadn't guessed what the strangers suddenly tromping through their fields were or where they'd came from, but ignorance hadn't kept them from exterminating the nearly defenseless Newts. But at the time, in Phyrexia, there'd been only whispers of disaster, thwarted destiny, and Newts transformed to meat in a place where not even the Ineffable could find them. The whispers reached Zancha's cadre along with orders that they were to move. New cadres were coming, fresh from the fane of flesh. Zancha caught sight of them as she dragged her box through the sharp, oily grass. The replacement cadres were composed of Newts who were bigger than her. Now, 2 of the larger Newts were quite the same, and every one was obviously male or female. Zancha had lost her destiny. She and the rest of her depleted cadre became redundant. Even the tools with which they turned the sterile Phyrexian soil were taken away, and the food cauldrons, which had always arrived promptly between periods of work and sleep and work, appeared only before sleep, if the cadre was lucky. Luck, a word that went with despair. Denied their promised place, some Newts crawled into their boxes and never came out again. Not Zancha. As regarded luck, Gix was lucky that she didn't know where to find him or how to destroy him. It took time to grow a Newt in the vats and more time to teach it the most basic tasks and transform it into a Phyrexian. So much time that the male and female Newts she glimpsed farming her cadre's old place must have been already growing in the vats when the demon had planted his blue-green spark in her skull. Gix had lied to her. It was a small thing compared to the other hardships she endured now that her cadre was redundant, but it sustained her for a long time until another wave of rumors swept across the first sphere. A knife had sliced through the passage that connected Phyrexia to the other world. It had broken and was beyond repair. Half the larger Newts were trapped on the wrong side, the rest were as redundant as she had become. Without warning, as was usually the case in her Phyrexian life, all the redundant Newts, including Zancha, were summoned to the 4th sphere to witness the extirpation of the demon Gix. The Ineffable's plan for Phyrexian glory had been thwarted by the knife, and someone had to be punished. Gix's lustrous carapace was corroded, and burnt before he was consigned to the 7th sphere for torment. It was a magnificent spectacle. Gix fought like the hellspawn he was, taking 4 fellow demons into the reeking fumarole with him. Their shrieks were momentarily louder than the roar of the crowds and furnaces, though they faded quickly. For a while, Zancha remained in the 4th sphere. She had no place, no assignment. In a place as tightly organized as Phyrexia, a placeless newt should have been noticeable, but Zancha wasn't. She dwelt among the gremlins. Even in Phyrexia, time spent in Gremlin Town couldn't be called living. The gremlins were flesh. They had to eat, and Zancha ate with them, as she learned things about flesh no complete priest could teach her.